There was a case that changed the way I see my work forever. An almost imperceptible detail at the scene made me question the whole story I had been told, and what I discovered ended up dismantling the official version of events. What seemed like a routine forensic procedure turned into a challenge that forced me to be more patient and observant than ever. It was that day when I understood that in this profession, beyond science, the key lies in knowing how to read the signs that no one else notices. Before starting, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. My name is Pablo Serrano, forensic doctor, and I have been working in Montevideo for over 15 years. I have seen everything: accidents, crimes, inexplicable tragedies. But the case I am going to talk about today is different, not so much because of the violence or mystery, but because of the lesson it left me. The call came on an ordinary afternoon. A man in his 40s had been found dead in his apartment, apparently the victim of a heart attack or a domestic accident. With no obvious signs of violence, the preliminary report was clear: natural death. But when I arrived at the scene, a tiny detail in the scene, didn't fit that story. It was a tidy room, a serene body on the bed, but there was a small detail in the position of the hands that caught my attention, a detail that at first seemed insignificant, but was a starting point for a much deeper analysis and an investigation that would shake the entire case. What seemed like a routine day at work turned into a puzzle that forced me to scrutinize every piece of evidence closely. In this video, I will tell you how that sign changed not only the interpretation of the event, but also my way of understanding forensics. Get ready for a story that shows why we should never underestimate what is left unsaid at first glance that I remember that day perfectly. I arrived at the scene like any other time, with a routine well learned and a pressing schedule. It was about a man found lifeless in a downtown apartment, apparently a victim of a heart attack or some natural cause. The police had made a fairly clear initial report, and there seemed to be no signs of violence or suspicious circumstances. But when I entered and began examining the body, something in the atmosphere made me stop. It wasn't a vague hunch. It was such a subtle sign that it wouldn't have caught anyone else's attention. But there it was, like a small spark that made me look again. What first caught my attention was the position of the body. There was a slight imbalance in the way he was lying, almost as if someone had hastily arranged him, but without care. My hands, accustomed to gathering information from every muscle, every joint, detected a strange stiffness that didn't fit with a sudden heart attack. The rigor mortis wasn't distributed as I expected. I then began to check every detail: the temperature of the skin, the level of moisture, muscle rigidity, the position of the limbs, those revealing signs that seemed minimal but that build the truth. I approached the nightstand where some personal objects rested. There was a glass with dried remnants of a drink, a package of medication, and a carefully folded letter. The letter caught my attention because of its neat handwriting and because, unlike the rest, it seemed intact, without traces or where marks, as if someone had left it there recently. I opened it delicately. It was a note addressed to the victim's husband, full of apologies and confusing explanations about a difficult situation. It mentioned something about visits to avoid, something that seemed to be hidden between the lines. This small revelation began to make me more alert. I continued the physical inspection. I noticed faint marks on the wrists, almost imperceptible. They weren't cuts or usual bruises, but something like abrasions, as if the person had been tied or held to something for a prolonged time. For a moment, the possibility of an attack drastically changed in my mind. What if this was not a natural death? The feeling that there was more than it seemed hurried me to request additional sample collection, to ask for a more thorough review of the scene by the police. I returned to the room with specialized lamps and a magnifying glass. There, in the least visible corner, I found a disturbed dust pattern, an almost invisible trail that seemed to indicate recent or forced movement. It was like a hidden signature of someone who had been trying to hide evidence. But it wasn't an ordinary trail. The particles showed a play of light and shadow that, together with the position of the body and that same note, began to make sense of a story that was not linear but twisted. I then decided to perform an electronic scan of the room to collect any biological residue that might have escaped sight or the first examination. Current technology reveals details that any human eye would overlook. What came to light was baffling. A minimal presence of a chemical compound, unidentifiable to the naked eye, mixed with organic remains near the body. It wasn't a common poison, and wasn't on the usual list of lethal substances, but something experimental, complex. This forced me to involve toxicology experts to advance the case. But what truly took my breath away was a small detail on the tip of the corpse's right index finger, a microscopic pattern, as if someone had left a pressure mark or a symbol, barely perceptible and only visible under a specific microscope. At first, I thought it was a mere irregularity in the skin or a consequence of decomposition. But upon careful analysis, I found it was not natural. It was almost like a sign, a hidden message, or a signature, something that seemed to speak to me directly from beyond. I do not exaggerate when I say that this small mark radically changed the course of the investigation. The day went on, and with it, the suspense within me grew. Preliminary analyses indicated that the cause of death was not a heart attack, nor an accident. Something more complex and extremely deliberate was hiding behind that scene. We began to review the deceased's context, personal relationships, possible enemies, risk situations, and it was then I began to see a pattern that no one had noticed. The victim had been entangled in a web of secrets, dubious dealings, and above all, covert threats. It was no longer just a forensic case, but a story intertwined with real life that was emerging little by little. I was sent confidential messages that had been stored on his phone, with veiled references to secret meetings and notes about projects that had to be stopped. The victim, at that moment, ceased to be just a stranger and began to appear as a key piece in a dangerous game. This turn took me by surprise because it quickly shifted the focus from a simple autopsy to a multidisciplinary investigation where every detail counted, where uncovering the truth behind the body was as urgent as understanding that subtle message I had found. With that new perspective, I was forced to review every contact of the victim again, to investigate possible enemies with access to unusual substances and the skills to devise such a plan. One of those contacts stood out, a figure surrounded by a low profile, with a background in clandestine operations and a network of influence that extended beyond our city. It was a piece that explained the sophistication level of the crime, but also added a level of danger for everyone involved, including my own safety. I felt I was beginning to scrape at a deep layer, and that someone could be watching my moves. The police increased security at the scene, and I received veiled warnings to slow down, not to get too involved in the matter. But something inside me wouldn't let me back down. I knew I couldn't ignore those signs, that something much bigger than a simple suspicious death was at stake. I began compiling all documentation, not only to proceed, but to protect that truth that seemed to stir among shadows. Amid that pressure, I made an almost imperceptible but revealing mistake for myself. I reviewed an external device I had found in a closed drawer near the nightstand, which I had initially overlooked. It was a small USB drive, hidden among personal papers. When I connected it to a secure device, I discovered encrypted files, documents, photos, and audios that still needed deciphering. They contained evidence, testimonies, and data that challenged the official version. The victim had documented everything in secret, had left a virtual trail that, if interpreted, would dismantle the whole setup. Now, the race was against time. With the help of cybersecurity experts, I began unlocking those digital doors. Each file unveiled layers of conspiracy that involved powerful people and had as its protagonist that victim who, despite being physically silenced, demanded justice through digital means. It was as if their body had been just a facade, while their mind and work continued fighting to bring the truth to light. While dealing with this torrent of information, one night, something made me stop everything and look out the window of my office, toward the rain-soaked horizon. The feeling of being watched, of every move being monitored, became tangible. But I also felt a strange certainty that the truth was about to come out, that hidden code, that small seal on the tip of their finger, was not just a signal to me, but a call to persistence, to tireless searching. It was not a message of despair, but of hope, because sometimes the faintest light in the midst of darkness can be the beacon that guides everyone to the truth. The following days continue with a slow unraveling of that network. Thanks to the combination of forensic analysis, digital data, and police work, some implicated individuals were identified, and above all, The magnitude of the plot behind that death, which at first glance seemed harmless, was understood. Each date, each place, each contact created a collage that contrasted with the cold initial scene. In that journey, I realized that my role was not just that of a mere observer, but a silent narrator who helps justice tell the truth that bodies scream without voice. And in the paradox of my work, the smaller the signal, the stronger its message, if one is willing to listen. That experience brought me closer to a realm few in our profession truly know, the blend of science, intuition, patience, and the ability not to be trapped by comfortable certainty. Because at the frontier of what we think we know, the deepest questions arise and the truth finally reveals itself in its most unexpected and moving forms. I had never felt so clearly that a body could speak to me, denounce, even fight after death, guiding me with subtle signs toward a mission that went beyond a simple medical report. And that is why, every time I look closely again, every time I listen to the silence in the smallest details, I know I am fulfilling more than professional duty. I am keeping alive the voice that refuses to be extinguished, and that, for me, is the true meaning of being a forensic doctor. Every time I reviewed one of those encrypted files, I felt I was getting closer to an enigmatic heart beating beneath the obvious. The way the victim had handled that documentation was meticulous, almost obsessive. Not only had they recorded direct evidence about their work, but also personal notes, reflections, and warnings about people they couldn't trust. There was a palpable feeling of isolation in their texts, as if they knew their life was in danger, and that only their own thorough preparation could ensure the truth survived their death. It was as if they had chosen me to continue that silent search. Days turned into weeks, and the case began to consume me in an unexpected way. It wasn't just about clarifying a death, but about the integrity of several institutions and the safety of people who might be entangled in that dark web. Every new decoded message implied a threat. Every digital piece of evidence that emerged revealed faces who preferred to keep everything buried under layers of lies and fear. Sometimes, I felt the walls of my lab closing in, as if I could hear the whisper of those invisible enemies watching from the shadows. Then, one day I received an anonymous call. It was a distorted mechanical voice, but with a clear intention. Be careful what you dig up, doctor. This truth can sink more than you imagine. There was no room for negotiation or explanation, just a cold, calculated warning. But far from scaring me, that warning sparked a fire in me that I hadn't felt with any other case. It was confirmation that I was onto something beyond the banality of common crime. It was a web of power and corruption that demanded caution, but also resolve. The tension in the lab grew. At times, the hours' work seemed endless. My eyes grew tired from staring at screens and papers, trying to connect points that were increasingly met with new incomprehensible knots. But the most unsettling thing was a constant feeling of being watched, that every move I made was monitored. I ended up changing my routines, locking my office, avoiding taking documents home. Some nights, I even chose to sleep at the hospital, just to be closer to a controlled environment, although paranoia never completely left me. One of the key moments came when, thanks to a rather intricate digital tracking, we managed to identify a direct connection between that low-profile person with clandestine background and a circle of apparently respectable officials and businessmen. That contact, which at first had appeared as a shadow, became a tangible character capable of ordering crimes with the coldness of someone used to keeping everything hidden. But we also discovered cracks in that network, strands of discontent, people willing to expose the truth, even if it meant risking everything. While awaiting the results of the advanced toxicological tests, I dedicated hours to reviewing images and reports. The police informed me that following that note, and due to new information, traces had been found on the street near the residence, tracks that matched the theory that someone had been lurking around the scene before and after the body was discovered. This only strengthened my conviction. The death had not been accidental or natural. However, despite everything we investigated, there was an invisible wall I could not breach without more data, as if someone had had time to prepare every detail to mislead. Days passed, and many fingers pointed to possible culprits, but nothing fit completely. Just when I thought all the pieces were a shapeless puzzle, I decided to return to the scene, alone, without pressure, with the calm needed to observe without the urgency of the moment. I slowly walked through the apartment, closing my eyes for a moment to capture things that only memory can bring. And in that silence, I understood that the signal I initially saw was more than a simple inconsistency. It was a code, an indication that the fight for truth did not end with an autopsy. From that day on, everything I thought I knew about my work changed. I understood that in forensic medicine, every clue is a voice, that every mark on a body is part of a discourse. Because it's not simply about confirming the cause of death, but about learning to read the silent message that every body leaves when life fades. And to do so, patience and precision become weapons as powerful as any laboratory or computer screen. I will never forget that case because it taught me that sometimes the truth is hidden in the smallest things, in signs that seem insignificant, but that if we know how to interpret them can change everything. That the difference between a solved case and one that remains in shadows may lie in the gaze we choose to cast, in the meticulousness with which we link every piece of data, and in the courage to explore beyond the surface. That day, death didn't just speak to me through the body, but reminded me why I do this job. And to you, who listen to this story, I leave a question with which I still wake up before sleeping. What signs might you be overlooking in your own life? Perhaps, as in my case, those small signs that seem insignificant are the ones that have the power to change everything. And that, in itself, is a troubling truth and also an invitation not to settle for the obvious, because behind every silence, there is a story waiting to be revealed. You just have to know how to look with patience, with attention, and with an open heart. I returned to the laboratory with a mix of unease and renewed determination. I was certain that every small detail was a vital piece in a puzzle whose complete picture was far from evident. My mind kept going over that tiny mark on the index finger, that pattern that seemed intentional, almost like an encrypted code deliberately left behind. It was not typical to find something like that, not even in more elaborate homicide cases. What did it mean? Who had left it? And why? In the following days, I dedicated many hours to investigating that microscopic signal. I consulted with colleagues specialized in various fields, from dermatologists to experts in semiotics and cryptography. Some looked at me skeptically, but in the end, the persistence and the level of detail I had reached sparked interest. Convinced that it was neither natural damage nor an accident, we began to analyze it as if it were a ciphered message, something that could be deciphered with the right tool. And it was that enigmatic mark was a result of deliberate pressure, an embossed seal, a particular kind of pattern that, according to an expert in Morse code specialized in tactile signals, represented a brief message, almost imperceptible but unequivocal. Look deeper. That revelation surprised me as much as it fascinated me. The victim, lifeless, had left us that trace, an invitation or a warning, a final clue that the truth was not just on the surface of their body, but in what surrounded it, in what had apparently been hidden. That idea reinforced my conviction that this death was much more than an isolated event. It was an open door, an incomplete story that someone had wanted to protect at all costs. I then decided to revisit the scene recordings and preliminary reports, patiently and carefully reviewing every photographic record from different angles. When examining one of the images of the apartment corner where I had detected altered dust with the special lamp, I noticed something new, an almost unnoticed detail, a double shadow on one of the walls near the window. It was not a lighting error nor any room configuration, but a subtle and specific reflection that seemed to alter perception of the space. From there, I investigated how that shadow could have formed, what objects or movements had caused it, and the result was unsettling. The shadow indicated that something or someone had been interacting with that space in a way no one had considered. I created a mental map of the room, combining the location of the body, the position of the displaced dust, the found note, and that play of light. It was a chaotic image, but still an image that revealed a pattern of events. Suddenly, what seemed like a small and innocuous space took on the meaning of a fragile scene, as if someone had been maneuvering in the dark, trying to hide or modify the scene. It was a trick, a setup disguised as a natural accident. The environment spoke to me. The victim had been manipulated, and someone had wanted to write a story different from the real one. When sharing these findings with the police, I noticed tension growing within the team. The autopsy, initially simple, was transforming into a complex investigation where personal relationships, dark secrets, and even political issues began to surface. I started to understand that the victim was not only at the center of criminal matter, but trapped in a larger web, woven with lies and fears. The confidential information that had come into my hands about their phone messages was only the tip of the iceberg. Those projects that had to be stopped were large-scale operations, and their death was an extremely calculated warning. But what truly increased the urgency was an unexpected analysis that arrived days later from the Advanced Toxicology Unit. The substance discovered, that rare chemical compound found near the body, had neural inhibitory properties and, in controlled doses, could produce a death that appeared natural to untrained eyes. An ingenious substance, created to avoid early arrests and immediate suspicions. It was not easy to detect, which was why it had been used. This led me to propose a hypothesis that seemed taken from a spy novel. The victim had been silenced with surgical precision, designed to hide the truth long enough to mislead investigators. One early morning, while reviewing a sequence of images captured by security cameras near the crime scene, I noticed a change in the recording rhythm, a gap of minutes without any footage, as if someone had interfered with the surveillance. That couldn't be a coincidence. That strategic interruption suggested external manipulation to erase evidence or plant something that would reinforce the official version. What seemed like a simple digital blackout became crucial evidence because it led me to think everything had been perfectly planned, designed to appear natural. And there, right between those lost seconds, the key to the mystery might be found. The pressure didn't come only from the case, but also from the environment. I felt firsthand the weight of invisible forces trying to stop the search. Friends and colleagues showed a mix of concern and implicit warnings. Some even started to distance themselves, as if getting involved meant direct danger. The police, who at first seemed allied, began showing reservations. The line between help and warning blurred. Everything indicated I had gone too far, that the truth was touching powerful interests willing to do anything to protect themselves. But there I was, holding the hand the victim had extended to me in the form of that code on their skin, a constant reminder that I had to look beyond, search in the details, trust my instincts. I couldn't let fear or silent pressure destroy all that effort. Going back would be to betray not only that lifeless body but justice itself. Somehow, I felt I carried the responsibility of being a voice for those who could no longer speak, the line between perpetual silence and the truth that refuses to die. That's why I decided to follow one last path that would take me to the darkest core of it all. I contacted one of the victim's confidants, someone who had remained in the shadows out of fear of reprisals, but who, thanks to the seriousness and delicacy with which I had handled the information, finally agreed to reveal crucial details. What I heard left me breathless. There was evidence of clandestine meetings, forged documents, and a plan to divert public attention through a massive disinformation campaign, all supported by a web of complicity that spanned the highest spheres of power. However, the informant also left me with a clear message. The truth can free you, but it can also destroy you. You must be ready for whatever you decide to do with it. That phrase stayed etched in my mind because it was the harsh reality. I was at a crossroads where the consequences of every step could be unpredictable, and despite everything, I felt a strange calm, a deepened conviction about the true weight of my work. Deep down, I understood something I had only sensed until then. The lifeless body I had examined carefully did not only speak through physical marks, but its story continued to reveal itself through every action it triggered, every digital gesture that remained as a silent legacy. It was a fight beyond death, a battle designed so that someone would listen, look beyond, and not allow falsehood to prevail. The struggle continued, like an underground river that doesn't stop before rocks or obstacles, and that night, when I turned off the lab lights and looked once more at that small mark on the index finger that had started it all, I knew the journey was just beginning. Because sometimes the truth is a mystery wrapped in tiny signals, in whispers that only those with will and patience can decipher. And although the darkness may seem impenetrable, every sign, every clue, is a beacon guiding toward justice. It was at that moment that I understood that the real task did not end with a report or the official closing of the case. My mission, and that of many colleagues working in the shadows, was to keep alive the search for that light, because in a world where lies can be perfectly disguised, only perseverance and attention to detail break the veil and give voice back to those who no longer have one. Even today, When I walk through the streets of Montevideo or pass by those places I now know as part of the story, I feel the whisper of the case accompany me. It speaks to me of the fragility of truth and the strength needed to protect it. It reminds me that, although the body has stopped beating, the spirit of justice remains, and that the smallest signal can be the one to change everything forever. For days, the pieces of the puzzle seemed increasingly scattered, and although each discovery brought something new, it also opened a new crack in the structure of what initially appeared to be a closed case. The hardest part was not dealing with the weight of the truth hidden in that tangle of papers, files, and digital signals, but maintaining calm and clarity to avoid falling into the trap of despair that often settles when a case becomes personal. My mind worked alongside the physical fatigue, and more than once I found myself speaking aloud in front of a computer, trying to organize my thoughts, convinced that within that internal dialogue lay the key to not losing my way. There was a moment, while I was once again analyzing the call and message records between the victim and their confidants, when a pattern began to emerge with unexpected clarity. It was not just a network of complicity and threats, but a chain of events planned with surgical precision, which had used death as just another piece on a much larger board. What initially looked like an isolated murder revealed itself as the tip of an iceberg affecting fundamentally different sectors, local politics, the financial system, and certain media outlets that, until then, seemed detached from the web. That was when I decided it was necessary to leave the lab. I needed a place and space to process everything without the constant pressure of the clock or the urgency of screens and technology. I walked for hours to Montevideo, breathing the cold dawn air while mentally arranging every detail, every possible connection. I recalled a phrase the victim had written in one of their files. Truth is not always a straight line. Sometimes you have a zigzag to reach it. That idea, simple but profound, became my guide. Because I knew that to uncover the hidden threads, I had to stop and observe the nooks and crannies, the silences, and the pauses that others overlooked. I returned to the case with renewed conviction, but also with the certainty that now I was not only being watched by external forces, but also by my own limits. There were moments when exhaustion worked against me, when my mind begged me to stop and let someone else continue. But something inside me refused to give up. The trust the victim had placed, albeit indirectly, in someone listening to their story was stronger than any fear or warning. And that same trust began to resonate in my close circle. Some people, who at first doubted, began to understand the magnitude of the case. Dr. Serrano is too deeply involved in something big, some colleagues said, but few knew how deep it had gone. An unexpected twist appeared when, precisely at that stage of progress, I received an unsigned package. Upon opening it, I found a small USB device accompanied by a handwritten note. The clearest eyes see what others prefer to hide. Don't stop. My heart raced, along with a mix of fear and hope. With my characteristic skepticism, I ran the file through all security filters, and after overcoming each technical barrier, what appeared on the screen was a series of videos and compromising documents, visual evidence of secret meetings, under-the-table transactions, and conversations not only planning to maintain the official narrative, but also to intimidate those who dare question it. Each file was a bomb that could blow up the corrupt system, but also a trap I knew I had to escape with caution. Meanwhile, the pressure began to become tangible, almost palpable in atmosphere. Anonymous calls intensified. Encrypted messages received on my phone suggested that the overseers of silence were unwilling to let the story advance without resistance. My steps began to be followed, and my personal life remained in a constant state of alert. The thin line between professional and personal blurred, and the constant surveillance reminded me I was not alone in this fight. I was facing an enemy who knew the city, the structure, and the weaknesses far better than I did. But my conviction remained intact. I then decided to turn to a support network that, until then, I had kept in reserve. Former colleagues from university and forensic computer experts who share my desire that the truth not be buried. With them, I began a joint analysis of the received files, cross-referencing each piece of data with official reports, public records, and press releases, slowly unraveling the tangle of lies. It was as if every confirmation fed an internal fire, but at the same time outlined the increasingly clear risks. The balance was delicate. The further we advanced, the more it seemed we approached a breaking point. One of the most critical moments came when we identified a high-ranking official who, without anyone suspecting, had been a key actor in evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. The name was linked to dubious financial movements in tax havens, and also to bribes ensuring the silence of several witnesses. That revelation shook the task force and rekindled the palpable threat. But the most unsettling part was knowing that this seemingly untouchable person had been paving their way in the shadows for over a decade. Something that made me think corruption was not just an isolated fact, but a structure that had firmly entrenched itself with patience and cunning, waiting for someone like me to challenge the facade. However, amid so much bad news, lights also appeared. Someone close to that network of complicity decided to break the silence. An employee with access to privileged information, fearful for their safety but aware of the injustice, began providing precise data, schedules, names, and fake documents created to divert attention. This confidential contact was essential to corroborate many of the clues that until then had been mere suspicions. Clandestine meetings in remote parts of the city, coded communications between businessmen and officials, and a parallel surveillance system designed to silence uncomfortable voices. Each new piece they gave us strengthened our resolve to keep going, despite everything. As I progressed, something curious happened. I noticed that some leads, instead of closing, multiplied. A revealing conversation led me to another hidden file inside a hard drive that had gone unnoticed, where the victim detailed not only their suspicions, but various hypotheses to protect themselves and ensure their truth was not lost. It was as if from beyond, they were guiding me step by step, handing over partial maps, coded indications and symbols and cryptic phrases that only someone with patience and intuition could decipher. That intangible connection gave me strength and confirmed that, in this battle of information and power, perseverance is key. But reality also showed its cruelest side. Little by little, the external pressure began to shape my personal environment. Stable relationships started to falter, the fear of those around me grew, and loneliness became a silent and constant companion. More than once, I thought about giving up, about closing that dangerous chapter that was consuming everything in its path. However, the feeling that I was part of something much bigger, and that I had to honor the one who left me that small but decisive sign, kept me firm. Because I understood that some truths have no price, and that although the path is difficult and lonely, there is something in justice worth that sacrifice. I remember one particularly long night, when exhaustion almost defeated me, and alone in a forensic room, with only the monotonous hum of the equipment for company, a new idea burst into my mind. What if that interruption in the cameras was not only to erase evidence, but also to implant something that totally diverted the investigation? That intuition led me to review the images again, with a digital magnifying glass, pixel by pixel, until I detected a subtle edit, a barely perceptible cut that altered the context. At that moment, I understood that every detail was both a weapon and a clue. The manipulation had been so fine that only someone obsessed with detail could unravel it. With that finding, the case made a qualitative leap. It was definitive proof that not only had someone tried to hide a crime, but also to rewrite history with lies. What had seemed like theories began to take concrete shape, and I realized this investigation was not just a medical or judicial act. It was an act of resistance. Because in simple terms, what was at stake was the possibility that the truth, the one many tried to bury, would emerge, and with it, the hope for real change. As the weeks passed, I reflected on everything I had learned. That death is not the end, but sometimes the beginning of a deep and necessary search. That the bodies arriving in my hands do not only speak through marks and symptoms, but through the connections they weave around them. That patience and attention to small details can change destinies. And that courage is not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. As I finished one of the last reports, I confirmed something I had felt from the start. This case would stay with me long after it was closed. The smallest sign, that mark on the finger, the encrypted documentation, and all that hidden network were not just evidence or clues, but a call to persistence and relentless pursuit. Because in a world where truth is often hidden beneath a sea of lies, one must be a beacon for those who cannot speak. And so, although the night advanced and the city slept, I knew that this story, which began with a seemingly silent body, would continue to resonate in every step I took. It was not just my most unexpected case, but a signal that changed everything, a lesson that, Even in darkness, the smallest detail can be the thread that unleashes justice. And with that thought, I remained ready to face anyone who tried to extinguish that light. Because in the end, the truth only surrenders to those willing to seek it until their last breath. That night, after discovering the manipulation of the images, I felt that strange vertigo caused by the certainty of treading on dangerous ground, but also the excitement that, finally, something big was beginning to take shape. It wasn't the first time I had dealt with attempted cover-ups, but the meticulousness with which the truth had been concealed in this case exceeded any expectations I had as a forensic expert. I kept staring at the screen, reviewing every second with almost obsessive care, trying to find those details others might consider insignificant, but which for me were the definitive clue. The next day, with my spirits a bit steadier, I returned to the crime scene. The early hours of dawn in Montevideo offer a special light, a mixture of the cold that comes down from the river and the smell of freshly brewed coffee from the shops that begin to wake. I walked slowly, mentally reviewing everything I had discovered and what still remained to be uncovered. As I moved forward, I thought I heard distant echoes, as if the city itself was giving signals, little voices that fell silent when someone passed too close. There was something in the air, a sense of contained threat, as if that place were the cradle of unspeakable secrets. I couldn't help but link every physical detail with the invisible clues, the unusual position of the body, the digital alteration of the cameras, the compromising information I had received. Everything was intertwined in an almost perfect web created to protect a goal much bigger than the victim herself. A goal I now understood, although I still wasn't clear on how far its tentacles reached. When I returned to my laboratory, aware that time was running out, I focused on analyzing a new batch of data sent by my confidential contact. We had established a secure channel and started exchanging documents and recordings that showed, beyond any doubt, the cooperation between high-ranking officials and businessmen to manipulate public functions and silence any uncomfortable complaints. As we reviewed each file, our group became a small nucleus of resistance against corruption. But alongside the certainty came fears. We knew that at any moment, someone could try to stop our progress, and not just with verbal threats. One morning, I received a call that chilled my blood. A distorted voice warned me to stop investigating if I valued my life and that of those around me. The warning was clear and direct, but instead of cowing me, it reinforced the impulse I had been burning inside for months. It was in those moments when loneliness became more palpable. The weight of risk followed me at every step, and constant surveillance stole hours from my personal life. But the certainty of being far from giving up pushed me forward despite the exhaustion. The following day, I decided to take a different approach. We called a small clandestine meeting with the support group. In a discreet room, lit only by a warm lamp, we reviewed every connection, every invisible thread we could tie to build a dossier capable of shaking the foundations of the corrupt network. My contact, nervous but determined, explained new events that had leaked the night before, alarming monetary movements, vehicles coming and going at reserved hours, conversations recorded sneakily. All of that painted an even darker picture, a vile machine that had operated for years without almost anyone looking up. However, one detail caught my immediate attention, something that at first glance could have seemed like a mistake, but that from the start I knew was much more. In one of the recordings, a small audio interference, almost imperceptible, contained a coded phrase that the victim had previously noted down in her notes. That coincidence could not be casual. I decided to focus on that fragment, isolate the pattern, and search for its hidden meaning. For hours I worked in the dark, wearing headphones and eyes fixed on the sound waves, until I managed to decipher the message. It was a direct call. The problem is not just what we hear, but what they don't let be heard. That phrase struck me deeply. The pieces not only denounced a network of lies acting on the surface, there was a complicit and manipulated silence, and perhaps a conspiracy to erase evidence far beyond what we imagined. The more I dug, the tension intensified. The calls became more aggressive. The invisible figures began to get closer. One afternoon, when I was returning home, I noticed cars that seemed to be following me. At the police station, where I usually felt some protection, my colleagues looked at me with caution, as if they feared the instability would reach them too. It was clear the pressure was expanding, and that not only my life was at stake, but the integrity of anyone who decided to get close to the truth. I lived on a precarious balance. That night, more exhausted than ever, I reviewed the victim's notes once again. Among the pages, I found a simple drawing, a maze with a single marked exit. The metaphor was clear, and immediately, almost without thinking, I went to an old public library to review records and archives that could not be found online or in official databases. I spent hours among dust and yellowed papers, tracking movements and names connected to the investigation. That was where I found something that left me frozen. A forgotten document linking a key figure in the local government to another victim years ago who had been buried as a work accident. The coincidence couldn't be more suspicious. It was evident that corruption and manipulation extended over time and had not changed at all. Names change, yes, but the plot remained intact, waiting to be uncovered. With that revelation, I felt I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer just a forensic doctor investigating crime. I had become a guardian of a hidden reality, a fighter in a battle that transcended my profession and my own strength. But I also felt a clear stillness that, despite the exhaustion, my work was far from over. There was an immense responsibility in being able to bring that signal to light. The following days were marked by clandestine meetings and constant analysis. In a late meeting, the internal contact warned us that their movements were being monitored, and that soon we would have to act quickly if we wanted to protect the evidence and those collaborating. That urgency turned every step into an act of precise calculation: how to distribute proofs, whom to trust, what information to leak, and when. Fear, although persistent, mixed with the adrenaline typical of those who fight, knowing history should change. In one of those talks, someone said a phrase I will never forget: "Truth is a seed that sometimes is sown in barren ground, but when it grows, nothing can stop its growth." It was a reminder that, despite difficulties, we were planting something no one could destroy. One night, we received an unexpected message. It was an anonymous invitation to a remote place with a promise: "What you seek is closer than you imagine. Come, and you will have answers." That impulse led me to organize an outing. Uncertainty and risk combined with hope. I knew it could be a trap, but I also understood there was no turning back. Arriving at that place, an old house on the outskirts of Montevideo, was like entering another world. Everything was silent, except for a small flicker of light moving in the second-floor window. I climbed carefully, and upon opening the door, I found something unexpected. A room full of documents, photographs, and recordings that evidenced not only the corrupt links, but also the names of those willing to face them. It was like a secret sanctuary of truth. For a moment, I understood the scope of the confidence the victim had left as a legacy. That room was the missing piece, a refuge where knowledge was preserved for those who want to continue. As I left, the fresh air hit my face. I looked toward the city, which slept peacefully and unknowingly, and thought about the responsibility and danger I now carried with me. I knew that signal, that tiny and discreet mark that no one expected, had changed not only the course of an investigation but also many lives. I understood that truth was not an easy gift, not a simple forensic conclusion, but a path of resistance and courage. As I walked back, I felt, for the first time in a long while, a mixture of peace and determination. There was a long road ahead with obstacles I knew would keep appearing, but also the certainty that, although the night is long and dark, the light never completely goes out. I had begun to give a voice to those silence tried to bury, and that was ultimately the greatest victory. Because, in the end, justice is not measured only in sentences or trials, but in the ability to hear the smallest signals, those that seem insignificant and yet have the power to change everything. And that night, while the city seemed to sleep, I understood there was no turning back. This story was only the beginning that I felt the cold run down my back as I closed the door of the old mansion, surrounded by the heavy silence that only the night can impose. Outside, the city maintained its apparent calm, but I knew that tranquility was a lit candle of a ship sailing through turbulent waters. That small light in that room was a lighthouse that had guided me to a discovery that, without a doubt, would change the history of more than one. From that moment on, every step I took bore the weight of that forbidden knowledge. The following weeks were a constant back and forth between immersive investigation into the evidence and the emotional toll that the pursuit and threats began to impose. I knew someone was watching my movements. That certainty became a constant companion, pushing me to be much more careful and reserved. At first, it was just a shadow, a suspicious noise beyond the door, a figure that disappeared when I tried to focus my gaze. But then that surveillance became intentionally palpable. Suspicious cars stopped in front of my house, attempts at anonymous calls, and several cryptic messages that warned me, without mincing words, how dangerous it was to continue. The pressure increased, and with it, the feeling that the enemy was much closer than I could estimate. In those days of uncertainty, I clung more than ever to what brought me here. The conviction that truth is an unstoppable force, even if sometimes it disguises itself as a whisper or an almost imperceptible sign. Between reviewing documents and videos, one of my group members handed me something different, a small notebook. It was small, with worn covers and yellowed pages, but contained notes the victim had written by hand, in tight and shaky handwriting. In those pages were hidden details no one had considered important, which now, with new perspective, seemed like decisive pieces to assemble a much larger puzzle. There were notes about secret meetings, names of people who apparently had little to do with it. But as I read, I realized there were nodes in a network woven with threads of power and silence. As I unraveled that material, I noticed that each piece of information led to another and so on. I found myself engulfed in endless hours of reading, highlighting, and several midnight calls to cross-check facts with my contacts. The body, once just another victim, slowly transformed into a symbol, a silent guide that unmistakably pointed to those weaving the web of impunity. I felt that my role was no longer limited to deciphering causes of death. I was now at a crossroads where truth and justice demanded a commitment far beyond professional. One night, I received an unexpected message on the secure channel we had created. An invitation to an informal meeting with a key informant who claimed to have evidence that would corner several implicated individuals. I knew it could be a trap or a distraction game, but it was also the opportunity we needed. With the utmost caution, we organized a meeting at a discreet cafe, without cameras or phones, only words and looks carrying more information than any document. The informant, a woman whose face I barely distinguished in the shadows of the place, handed me a flash drive containing unpublished recordings, compromising conversations, and a list of names and dates revealing the structure of that false protection network that had covered up incompetence, abuse, and homicides like the one we were investigating. Returning home, anxiety made every fiber of my body throb. I knew that material had to be handled carefully, not only because of its content, but because it was truly a detonator, a time bomb that could blow up an entire armored system. As I plugged the flash drive into computer, I mentally reviewed every hypothesis to prepare a plan. My hands trembled slightly, not only from exhaustion, but because of the weight of responsibility. It was then I heard that sentence resonate again in my mind. The problem is not just what we hear, but what they don't let us hear. I had to listen carefully and close any cracks that would allow the dark web to remain hidden in the shadows. In the following hours, I worked patiently and meticulously, listening to and reviewing the recordings, many fragmented and with suspicious interruptions clearly intended to prevent some information from being understood. However, I managed to reconstruct conversations involving public officials and powerful businessmen, planning and executing maneuvers to intervene in judicial processes and coerce key witnesses. Some of those voices had a vulgar, almost careless tone, but it was precisely the arrogance that made their words even more painful. They spoke of the country and its institutions as if they were loot, a safe they could access without any scruples. That dawn I also understood I was not alone in this fight. In different parts of the city, some other people, anonymous heroes, I decided to call them, were gathering evidence, preparing disclosures, and planning how the truth could leave its clandestine refuge to come to light. Somehow, we were scattered fragments of the same force, seeking to break the vicious circle of impunity. I felt an even greater urge to keep going despite the lurking fear, aware that the most dangerous consequence would be to remain idle. However, progress was not a straight line. Pressure, risks, and doubts also forced me to feel the human side. Uncertainties, exhaustion, the need to protect my family, the fear that all this could destroy us. One particularly difficult night, When I went out to buy something for dinner, I found my car scratched with eloquent messages meant to intimidate me. I didn't want fear to reach the solid ground of my home, but reality hit me hard. It was the first time I realized a battle would not be won only with evidence, but with unbreakable resistance against imposed silence. To avoid giving in to despair, I clung to the routine I could still control. My mornings began to have small sacred rules: a strong coffee while organizing files, brief calls just to confirm progress, and some time to read unhurriedly, seeking in literature stories of those who had faced greater forces. In those readings, I found unexpected comfort. The certainty that the fight against corruption and lies is neither new nor exclusive to Montevideo or Uruguay. It was an echo crossing eras and borders, a crack through which light could enter. And it was precisely that light I began to glimpse when, in cross-analysis, I discovered a pattern no one had noticed before. Certain dates when money movements and accounts of trusted people coincided with the temporary disappearance of important documents in official archives that confirmed that the corruption network did not only operate in the shadows, but also manipulated entire systems, from the physical legacy of documents to financial circuits. I understood that to be effective, denunciation in courts or media would not be enough. We would need a very careful strategy to make the impact unavoidable. Meanwhile, tension continued to grow. Threats became more aggressive, not only through messages or surveillance. One night, while returning from work, I felt a violent impact against my vehicle. It was a clear attempt at intimidation. I called the police, but those same forces, although theoretically protectors, showed evasive looks and not entirely sincere questions. It was a clear sign that corrupted spheres had extended reach. From that day on, I moved always accompanied, even for daily activities. Security became a priority, though it took away comfort and spontaneity. At the same time, the internal resistance network began to bear fruit. Through contacts in independent press and civil organizations, we managed to leak carefully selected information, revealing the plot little by little without risking evidence or collaborators' safety. The impact was immediate. There was public outrage, debates and forums, and evidence that the citizenry was not willing to close their eyes to those truths. The corruption, which seemed untouchable, began to be questioned. Public pressure, a new fire, had started to take hold. In the middle of this whirlwind, I received an anonymous email with an attached file. I opened the document cautiously and discovered recent photographs of private meetings with figures who, until then, were not on the original suspect list. I realized the network was even deeper, with connections touching sectors I thought were beyond suspicion. This definitively convinced me that the investigation required a multidimensional approach, involving journalists, lawyers, activists as well. No one could do it alone. It was then that, at a team meeting, someone mentioned a phrase that stayed engraved in my mind. Truth is a living organism, adapting to survive, but also to break free. That idea resonated because, although we were aware of the real threat, we also felt that each step we took brought us closer to a new balance. A balance where justice, although imperfect, could gain ground and, beyond any trial or sentence, leave an indelible mark on the collective conscience. But before thinking of definitive victories, I knew there was one last and decisive challenge: ensuring protection of those who trusted in open spaces in that dark web. Every name we shared, every document we disseminated, risked not only the investigation, but the lives of brave people. Organizing security protocols, establishing support networks, and keeping the operation secret became the center of our priorities. That night, at the end of an exhausting day, I sat at my desk and stared at the dim light of the monitor. I thought about the victim who had brought me to that point, the colleagues who supported me, and the story that should not be buried again. I remembered her note about the labyrinth and the only marked exit, and I understood that exit was not a destination but a path that had to be traced step by step, carefully, patiently, with the certainty that no sign, however small, should be ignored. Turning off the light, in the stillness of the Montevideo night, I felt a mixture of vulnerability and strength. The distant city noise faded, and in that inner silence, a clear voice told me that the battle was just beginning, and that the unexpected is always just around the next turn of history. I knew that the signal that changed everything was no longer just a symbol. It was a commitment never to give up, to find the truth in the shadows, and to give voice to those whom silence tried to bury forever. Days passed, and the exhaustion kept piling up like gravel that slips between the soles of your shoes and makes every step hurt. The external pressure continued to grow, and with it, the need to remain calm amid the chaos. Every anonymous message, every warning sign did nothing but tighten the rope of this nightmare that seemed endless. However, it was at that moment of greatest tension that something unexpected appeared. A new piece in the seemingly immovable puzzle began to shift. A detail that first seemed subtle, almost invisible, but which, like an inaudible whisper at first, grew until it became a roar that would completely change the course of the entire investigation. Reviewing the recordings for the umpteenth time, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed until then. In one of the conversations, fragmented and broken, barely audible, a place was mentioned, a name that was not in any of the lists or documents we had gathered. It was a particular, discreet address near the port of Montevideo, where clandestine meetings had apparently been held to plan the darkest maneuvers. That revelation opened the door to a new line of investigation, one that made me feel we were touching the truth with the tips of our fingers, but also meant venturing into even more dangerous and less explored territory. I then decided it was time to leave the confinement imposed by fear and take direct action. I coordinated with a couple of trusted colleagues in operation to visit that place, always proceeding with utmost discretion to avoid raising suspicion. The night was our ally. Stepping into that industrial, dark, and almost deserted area at that hour created a strange feeling, a mix of adrenaline and caution. Each of us bore not only the weight of our technical equipment, but also the invisible yet ever-present and heavier burden of uncertainty. As we approached, we noticed the facade remained apparently harmless, but we knew appearances were precisely what the corrupt network used to camouflage its actions. We observed for hours, recording movements, taking photographs, gathering distant conversations by maneuvering with listening devices that barely captured fragments but corroborated our hypothesis. That site was a nerve center, a true hub where moves were orchestrated that had until then remained beyond the reach of justice. One of the most unexpected moments occurred when we saw a familiar figure leave, someone who publicly maintained an impeccable image, a respectable citizen of high reputation. Seeing him there, entering the dirty game, shattered several of our beliefs about how far the tentacles of this network reached. It became clear that the investigation went beyond what we had imagined, but it also brought with it an immediate effect, the feeling that we were touching something too big to handle alone. The responsibility became even more overwhelming. However, despite the fear and the latent threat, I also discovered a renewed strength within myself, as if all the suffering and sleepless nights had created a resilience that not only protected me, but pushed me to move forward without looking back. Because I knew that taking a wrong step could cost me dearly, but not advancing was to surrender the dignity and duty I had as a forensic doctor and citizen. Upon returning, and already in the relative safety of my home, I reviewed in detail the information collected that night. I noticed that among the digitized documents there was coded correspondence, encrypted messages with a simple yet effective method within the group itself. I began constructing a mental map of connections with names, dates, and relationships that seemed like a complex web of intertwined interests. Each discovered link was an alert signal. Each new name, more evidence of how corruption had infected areas that were supposed to be untouchable. But it was also a beacon of hope, because the truth, when pieced together like a puzzle, cannot be ignored forever. Shortly after, the emotional exhaustion took a step further and struck me without warning. The early morning was a hostile territory of disturbing thoughts. I imagined the consequences for my family, the moves we would have to make to protect ourselves, my children's faces, their questions, and my forced silence. My wife, my silent pillar, began to notice my weariness, but I couldn't tell her everything. Not yet. It was a solitary struggle, albeit accompanied, where vulnerability had to be hidden to avoid further harm. The night seemed endless, and while the city slept, I felt the weight of the world resting on my shoulders. That same week, another unexpected turn occurred. A colleague, who until then had stayed on the sidelines out of her own fear, contacted me with information that would change the game. She had access to internal documents from one of the implicated security agencies, conclusive proof of how previous investigations had been manipulated, how reports were buried and evidence vanished with chilling systematization. That risky and urgent leak came with veiled requests that the matter not be made public until we had an even stronger backup, a comment that was no coincidence. The network we face had far-reaching tentacles in those very agencies, and only with a coordinated strategic plan could we avoid being crushed. The news filled me simultaneously with hope and fear. On one hand, it was confirmation that we were on the right path, with valuable allies and ever-growing evidence. On the other, the darkness surrounding those security bodies seemed even denser and more terrifying. The idea that some of those who should protect us were involved in these dirty practices created a deep sense of distrust. But we had to move forward because being paralyzed meant giving victory to that shadow we all wanted to expose. The following days became a delicate dance. We worked under strict schedules, extreme digital and physical security measures, and clandestine meetings that felt like part of a spy novel. Each encounter was an effort to organize information and prepare how and when to release these truths to the public, aware that the impact could be enormous and the powerful's response fierce. It was not a task for the weak or those seeking instant glory. It was a heavy, slow commitment, yet indispensable. And then, not without a hint of surprise, something happened that froze me for a few seconds before throwing me into immediate action. An external contact informed me about a leak on social networks. A partial copy of our files had begun circulating anonymously. It was a moment of maximum alarm. Premature exposure increased risks and imminent danger for all involved. However, I also understood that, paradoxically, this unauthorized action could act as a spark that ignited a flame impossible to extinguish. That night was a mixture of anxiety and reflection. I realized the battle had already transcended the walls of the lab, the desk, and the clandestine cafe. We had set in motion a critical mass of knowledge and decision that, although imperfect, could not be stopped. There it was before me, the undeniable proof that the search for justice is a force that can arise from any corner, and often does so in the most unexpected way. Fear still beat loudly, but that dawn I found a calmness I hadn't felt since it all began, the certainty that truth knows no eternal silence. The next day I met with a team to review the situation and rethink the strategy. We decided to accept that the leaked material was just a preview, a first blow that would generate chaos, questions, and heated reactions. But it would also be the start of a social awakening, the opening of a crack in the wall of impunity. We agreed to reinforce protocols, protect witnesses, and prioritize the safety of those brave enough to tell what many wanted to keep silent. The task would not be easy nor quick, but there was mutual recognition. We were at a historic moment, one in which truth finally had a real chance. In those days, still tense, I took time to remember the initial victim, the person whose body and notebook had been the invisible trigger. I thought about how their silence had transformed into voice through time and the will of anonymous people like us. That idea became a beacon that illuminated my path when the darkness seemed deepest. It was tangible proof that, although evil seems invincible, a single sign, a single truth, can start a transformation none of us would dare to imagine in the hardest days. But then, in the midst of that brief respite, new troubling news arrived. A close friend in security forces alerted me that our team had been detected more than expected, that someone was trying to infiltrate our circle with false identities, and that the enemy had begun playing at a level beyond all our expectations. Fear took hold of me again, but not to paralyze me, rather to warn that the game was only changing phase. We were on an upward spiral, and every move had to be calculated with the precision of someone walking a tightrope over an invisible abyss. That night, before closing the day, I looked out the window as Montevideo slowly faded under a blanket of twinkling stars. I thought about everything we had gone through, every contained fear, and every revealed truth. I thought about the silences we had broken, and those still waiting to be broken. And then, in the whisper of the wind brushing the leaves of the jacaranda in my garden, I felt that sign that had changed me forever was not just the beginning of an investigation, but the persistent heartbeat of an eternal struggle, that of those who refuse to accept lies and decide to illuminate even the darkest shadows, step by step, relentlessly, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. The next day dawned slow, almost lazy, as if the entire city were recovering from the tremor that had initiated the leak, and we ourselves felt the modulated weight of calm in the midst of the storm. Every step I took seemed filled with a new caution, but also with a silent determination, the kind that arises when you know there is no turning back, that you are forced to move forward regardless of weariness or sleepless nights. I returned to the office with fresh notes and recordings, slowly reviewing each testimony, every piece of deciphered information, searching for connections that were not evident at first glance. It was not just a matter of gathering data. It was a subtle, almost intuitive art, carrying the need to understand how those broken pieces fit into a greater picture, a plot that confronted us with invisible but deadly enemies. As we delved deeper into this dark web, the anonymous messages that previously seemed to me like simple attempts to distract us now revealed themselves as veiled warnings, perhaps even cautions disguised as cryptic puzzles. We began to notice patterns, recurring codes in the text, references to people, places, and events that needed to be more than just clues, almost secret doors to an underground world that our society would prefer forget. Fatigue remained, but the mind stayed alert, because in environments like this, losing concentration was an unthinkable luxury. During those days, hours seemed to slip through our fingers while design and analysis generated an almost hypnotic rhythm. There was no room for trivial urgencies or banal distractions. Every moment was dedicated to uncovering the truth hidden beneath layers of lies and silence. It was then that the first direct blow arrived. One of our informants, someone who had so far maintained a careful anonymity, handed us a folder with unpublished documents. Upon opening it, we felt ourselves delve even deeper into the heart of the problem. There were financial records, banking movements that defied logic, discretionary transfers, and most disturbing of all, direct connections with figures who projected a clean, irreproachable, almost untouchable image in the public sphere. As I cross-referenced those data with known names, I felt my stomach knot up under the weight of a reality that exceeded expectations. Those people were not only implicated, but seemed to be key pieces in a network that had infiltrated essential services and acted with devastating impunity. The conversation that afternoon with the team turned into an intense session of analysis and reassessment, where fear mixed with an increasingly palpable responsibility. We could not afford mistakes or hasty decisions. Every action had to be measured, calculated with surgical precision. However, pressure began to manifest in unexpected ways. Layoffs in key areas, abrupt protocol changes, and most concerningly, clear signs of surveillance over our own group. Unknown individuals appeared nearby, calls I couldn't identify, and a constant feeling of invisible eyes following each of our steps. It was a sign that we were treading on sensitive ground and that, although the truth was beginning to gain ground, the darkness was ready to defend itself mercilessly. Amid this increasingly tense atmosphere, a twist arose that added even more complexity to the plot. A colleague from the interior of the country, with whom I had previously worked on less high-profile cases, stepped forward. He brought information from unexpected sources, accounts that confirmed this corrupt network was not limited to Montevideo, but had branches in other regions, and that part of the structure involved transnational criminal organizations. This revelation expanded the spectrum of danger and reach, forcing us to rethink the strategy on administrative and legal levels. The challenge was scaling up, and although we felt the unmistakable mix of vertigo and exhaustion, it was also a time to reaffirm our ideals and mission. That same day, while reviewing documents at home, a brief and signed and unaddressed message arrived that chilled me to the bone. Not all allies are where you think. Be careful. The warning was direct, implicit, a reminder that gray areas, that beat in which loyalty becomes blurry, could be more dangerous than visible enemies. I paused for a moment, staring at the ceiling and trying to contain the mix of adrenaline and anxiety. On that moonless night, the meaning of that phrase echoed loudly, a reflection of the human complexity always present in the deepest investigations. I knew I had to take extreme precautions, guard every relationship, and evaluate every step with greater rigor, because the threat was no longer just external forces, but possible internal shadows. In the days that followed, that warning became tangible as we detected internal irregularities, documents diverted from traditional paths, some contacts going silent without explanation, and certain emails intercepted or altered. Most worrying, some team members began to notice unknown calls, subtle questions probing classified information, and in one case, an attempted remote access to one of the computers where key evidence was stored. Paranoia became part of the daily landscape, But we refused to give up. There was a tacit pact among us, an unbreakable commitment above fatigue or fear. The investigation had become a living entity with its own rules and rhythm, and every team member knew that playing in this league meant exposing not only the truth, but also one's own convictions and lives. Aware of our vulnerable position, we reinforced measures. Meetings changed places and formats precisely. New layers of encryption were implemented, and we maintained closer contact with honest security units that could support us, albeit with absolute discretion. Paradoxes that at that moment added to uncertainty rather than relieve it. Every advance seemed to attract new obstacles, as if the system itself had learned to defend itself with silent, calculated cruelty. But beyond that, we witnessed small acts of unexpected courage and loyalty, encrypted messages of support arriving when least expected, a network of invisible hands reinforcing the internal conviction that we were not alone in the fight. One night, while reviewing a report detailing a clandestine meeting that had occurred weeks before, a window into the story suddenly opened. There was the name of someone who until then had gone unnoticed, an apparently secondary character whose role, when analyzed in conjunction with other events and testimonies, began to gain weight as a possible key link in the chain. That connection triggered a series of calls and cross-checking that led us to discover one of the darkest nodes of the network, a property used not only for planning, but for illegal operations involving everything from money laundering to influence peddling. It was a kind of evidence every forensic body would dream of having to piece together the full story, but at the same time, an exponential risk for all involved. The level of attention increased exponentially. Pressure came not only from the external environment, but also from the very nature of the investigation, which demanded extreme balance between speed and discretion. Patience became the scarcest and most valuable resource. We began organizing clear, defined meetings with specific objectives. Dead hours disappeared, and every gained minute seemed decisive for the next move. The sensation of walking on minefield intensified, but the commitment remained intact because in the end, we knew who we were fighting for, the truth, so that the voice silenced by corruption could finally break its chains. What came next was unexpected. An external player, a journalist who had morbidly followed the initial leak, got in touch with me with a proposal that caught me by surprise. He had in his hands pieces of information that, although superficial to us, had the potential to capture public attention, a crucial trigger to force change from the outside. Our alliance was cautious at first, a dance of trust and verification, aware that exposing too early could unravel years of work. But we also understood that media strength was an opportunity to give an unbeatable volume to truth, without fear of reprisals or imposed silence. The weeks that followed marked the most critical moment of the investigation. Suddenly, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Unexpected political moves, urgent meetings at the highest levels, and an evident increase in social polarization. The news spoke of scandals, official leaks, and the opening of parallel investigations. But we knew that behind that media noise, hidden details remained, reserved evidence to sustain a solid case, because real justice does not dance to the rhythm of spectacle, but the beat of truth proven and patiently constructed. The tension was palpable, but the feeling that we were, perhaps for the first time, facing a real opportunity to change the course of things grew slowly. I will never forget that night, when after an exhausting day, I sat down to review one last time the documents and messages that would set the definitive course for the next stage. It was like looking at a fractured map that was finally finding its paths and safe routes. It was then that I understood with absolute clarity that every signal, every detail, no matter how small it had seemed at first, had been part of the impulse that brought us there. I remember the phrase that had accompanied me the entire time. Everybody has something to reveal, you just have to know how to observe. And I understood that in this investigation, we were not only talking about physical bodies, but about structures, social networks, a constant struggle between truth and power. While the city slept under the cold mantle of night, I felt a weight lift from my chest. We had walked dangerous paths, crossed dark spaces, faced our own limits, but we were one step closer to breaking that seemingly impenetrable wall of silence. I knew the battle was not over, that the road would continue to be full of challenges and shadows, but that dawn, in the almost sacred stillness of my study, I found a certainty that truth, no matter how hidden, always finds a way to be heard. And in that moment I knew, without a doubt, that no lie is strong or long enough to overcome the relentless force of a true sign, a whisper that becomes a shout, and people who, despite everything, decide to keep fighting. That impulse, that trigger I felt that night in my study, quickly transformed into a contained urgency. I couldn't let that clarity dissipate with the dawn. Every piece of data, every clue, and every signal we had been gathering had to be interconnected with almost surgical precision. The next phase of the investigation required a different approach, more meticulous, because we were no longer just following leads. We were facing directly a structure that knew how to hide, adapt, and attack. But I also knew it was essential to maintain control, not give in to vertigo or despair, because in this shadow game, even the smallest mistake could cost us much more than professional failure. In the hours that followed, I decided to return to basics. That discipline any forensic expert knows must be the guiding principle: patient observation and careful analysis. I immersed myself in the files once again, rereading old reports, interviews that may have gone unnoticed, details that once seemed trivial and now shone with a new light. Something told me that in those dormant fragments there were more answers than in the major revelations. I found contradictions in accounts, small omissions in official documents, and movements in the shadows that no one had noticed. They were subtle signs, but for someone trained to read between the lines, a map to the perfect truth. I could not afford to forget anything, because that signal that changed everything was a key that could open the door that had remained firmly sealed for years. Suddenly, in the midst of this mental marathon, the phone rang. A familiar voice, trembling but determined, communicated that a secret meeting had been arranged with one of the key players, someone with information capable of destroying the network from within. The meeting was set in a discreet place, far from prying eyes, in an almost forgotten cafe downtown, with a clientele that raised no suspicions. It was night, and the fine rain made the city look even gloomier, as if the sky itself shared our burden. I arrived early, knowing that patience had to be another ally, because in these moments impatience was a luxury that could give advantage to those who prefer to keep us in the dark. I waited, watching every movement around me. Finally, the figure appeared, a person who until then had walked among shadows and veiled confidences. Their eyes betrayed deep exhaustion, but also the urgent need to be heard and protected. When they spoke, their voice was an urgent whisper, as if every word were an act of courage. They told how this corrupt network had tentacles transcending national borders, infiltrating unimaginable places, from financial institutions to police forces, and how economic power had become a weapon to impose silence and fear. They revealed silent pacts, hidden evidence, and the existence of a list containing names no one was supposed to know, a list that, if brought to light, could trigger an unstoppable avalanche of change. Hearing those words was like unearthing a mine beneath my feet, knowing danger was closer than ever, but also certain that we were accomplishing the impossible, giving shape to the monster that until then had existed only in rumors and suspicions. I returned to the office with a mind as restless as the nighttime traffic flowing through Montevideo. I shared the information with the team, already on the brink of exhaustion, but able to recognize in that revelation a renewed energy and confirmation that our work was making history. They organized sudden meetings, with reinforced protocols and an encrypted communication scheme that made everything more complex but necessary. Amid all this, loyalty became currency, and the slightest mistake could be fatal. The feeling of being in the eye of a storm did not disappear, but there was something stronger, an invisible bond between us that kept us steady, a tacit agreement not to give up. However, in this game of mirrors, another unexpected twist appeared. That very night, access to the investigation security systems was breached in a more sophisticated and direct way than ever before, gaining entry to files that were supposed to be top secret. Internal alarms sounded, paranoia intensified, but suspicions also grew. Did we have infiltrators? That question was not just paranoid thinking, but a real ghost haunting every meeting and call. The clearest symptom appeared when one of the most trusted collaborators was accused, without solid evidence, of acting against the group. That divided us, struck at the heart of the trust we had built over months. The team fractured momentarily, and that fracture threatened to ruin everything we had achieved. But amid that crisis, voices of understanding also emerged, Explanations showing that the network not only attacked from outside but undermined from within, using fear to fracture alliances and sow doubt. It was a crucial moment to stop and think. We couldn't fall into their game. We couldn't allow the darkness to gain ground from within. We decided to face the crisis with transparency, conviction, and renewed commitment. We restored protocols, reinforced trust among those who remain with us, and established external support networks to protect us without exposing anyone. The risk was enormous, the uncertainty growing, but the purpose remained intact: to reveal the truth, no matter the cost. In those difficult weeks, I understood that beyond forensic science and technique, the real battles are fought on human terrain, in the strength found in empathy and shared truth. Little by little and with silent work, those cracks began to close. New testimonies came forward strongly. Evidence that had been hidden for years began to take shape, and political movements could no longer ignore the popular outcry the press had ignited. I felt an unstoppable tide was being built, a wave meant to shake much more than individuals or institutions, but an entire system based on impunity. The tension turned into hope growing with every advance, with every steady step we took despite threats and obstacles. But just as a light seemed to clear a path, a new sign appeared, one that chilled my blood. A package without a sender left in front of my house. Inside, a small audio device, and when played, a muffled but clear voice uttered a phrase that echoed in my conscience. The truth is a fragile mirror. Protect it or it will shatter forever. That warning once again cast shadows over our work, reminding us that we cannot lower our guard for a second, that opposing forces will continue to use fear, manipulation, and violence to stop what we have begun. The feeling that we were in a deadly game increased, but there was no room for paralyzing fear. We knew we were facing a key moment, a threshold that, if crossed with intelligence and caution, would mark a before and after for our society. Thus, I closed that day not with a piece of a solved case, but with a firm conviction that the signal I had found at that initial scene, that small clue that seemed insignificant, had been the bridge to reveal a much larger and more painful truth. The investigation had transformed into a battle not only against crime, but against the very shadow of silence and indifference. And although the story remained intact in its complexity, in the almost solemn calm of that early morning, I understood something fundamental: that every body, every piece of evidence, every whisper not yet heard, holds the power to change everything. You only need the patience to wait, the courage to seek, and the will to never stop observing, because in the end the truth always finds its way, and when it does, nothing is the same again.